During his latest interview with Submission Radio, Colby Covington talked about a potential return to MMA. I say potential because this guy is like a solar eclipse. He rarely fights. The difference is that a solar eclipse has a lot of attention, and Colby Covington has had a lot of attention on him in his recent fights, but after that last pathetic performance against Leon Edwards, I don't know who's going to be interested in watching this guy fight. With Dennis, he unfortunately did not talk about fighting Ian Garry. He did not talk about fighting Shavkat Rakhmonov, no surprises there. He didn't even mention Jack Della Maddalena. He didn't talk about fighting any top welterweights. Who did he talk about?
Here's your chance, Charles Oliveira. I'm the biggest fight you can get. Former world champion, the king of Brazil, the king of Miami, Donald Trump's favorite fighter. What's going to be bigger for your legacy, Charles, than coming and fighting me?
And the however many years retired Nick Diaz, who has had one fight since 2015. At this point, it is full mask off for Colby Covington. He is no longer a serious fighter, not even close. He is all about keeping up this tough guy image, who is this pro-Trump, America First Republican, and that is how he is going to make the most of his money. Hence why he puts all this effort into going on these conservative podcasts, which we have seen from Covington before. He was on Candace Owens' show a few years ago, and has been on a few others, but lately, that is all Colby Covington does. We've seen him on Fox News, we've seen him on the Twins podcast, we've seen him on PBD several times, we've seen him recently on Adam Sosnick's podcast with a bunch of women, maybe because Colby Covington is trying to look like them. And on the podcast, he had a lot to say about Sean Strickland. While Sean Strickland also has his fair amount of detractors, this shows more and more that Colby Covington is digging his own grave in terms of his popularity with the fans. He has no interest in fighting any of the top contenders. He's only interested in fighting lightweights, or welterweights who have been retired for a long time, or they're just old and coming off losses. On top of that, when he does get into the cage, like against Leon Edwards, he's not even going to try if he feels he's going to lose. His main intention is to waste everybody's time, take the least amount of risks, so that he can come out looking okay, and carry on this pre-rehearsed script of how he was robbed, how the system's against him, and all about MAGA, 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 MAGA. The thing is, we have seen this from Colby Covington for several years. Ever since his 2 fights with Kamaru Usman, he has only been interested in fighting guys who are much older than him, coming off losing streaks, who he is heavily favoured to beat. He's called out lightweights, while he conveniently avoids talking about welterweights who are close to their prime like he is, who are riding some momentum, and he's complained about being hard done by the officials before, in his 2 fights with Usman. So why is it now that the fans are turning against Colby Covington when we've seen him do these things before? Well, in this video we're going to go through Colby's evolution with the fans since he invented this bad guy character, how it started to work for him and he became a somewhat of a cult hero, and how overnight he has completely ruined it and become a full-on court jester. We all know how this image started for Colby Covington. He was about to not be re-signed by the UFC despite having to fight Damian Maia in Brazil. After winning the fight, he cut a very unexpected promo where he called out the Brazilian crowd. Within seconds, Colby Covington's UFC career was saved, and he got an interim title shot against Rafael dos Anjos. During that time, a lot of fans weren't interested in Colby Covington, because his image came across as very forced, and many saw him as a very clumsy villain, who often stumbled over his words.
See, now we're on my terms, motherfucker.
Didn't often sound convincing on the mic.
There's a reason you're at the little kids' table, scrub. Get used to it, Junior.
And even got out trash-talked by Michael Bisping on the commentary desk.
We just said you fought a very, very good fight. If you care to listen, open your ears and stop talking so much crap for 1 minute. You might hear that we actually gave you some compliments.
Stop talking crap.
Colby.
Isn't that your king? That's what you do the best. That's all you do is talk.
Over the next few years, because there were a lot of fans who didn't gravitate towards Kamaru Usman, Covington was wanted by some fans to be the world champion, because they could relate to him a little bit more. And regardless of how you feel about Colby Covington, there's no doubt that he did the best job against Kamaru Usman out of any welterweight for many, many years until Leon Edwards came along. For that reason, many fans were excited to see Colby Covington fight for the belt because the fights were always entertaining and they were competitive. Also, as Colby Covington started to fight other contenders who were on their way out, such as Tyron Woodley and Jorge Masvidal, The fans had turned on them to such an extent they wanted to see Colby Covington on top. Tyron Woodley had always failed to get a lot of fans to like him, and Jorge Masvidal, as I explained in this video shortly once I got on YouTube, had become such a forced actor himself who put on an image and was so entitled that many fans wanted him gone from the top of the division, myself included. I was so tired of seeing this guy put on this fake image that was so incredibly forced. And after that fight where Masvidal pulled the very weak move of sucker punching Covington in the streets in the name of defending the honor of his children, many fans rightfully pointed out that Colby Covington never mentioned Masvidal's kids, showing that Covington had a lot of fan support behind him, the most really in his entire career. So Covington's popularity was growing exponentially at a time when, instead of fighting top contenders who were coming off winning streaks and were a similar age group to him, he was only fighting washed up old men who were coming off losing streaks. And after the Masvidal fight, he called out Dustin Poirier, who was a lightweight, and instead of receiving the criticism he is getting now for calling out Charles Oliveira, Colby Covington was praised by a lot of his fans. And Dustin Poirier, a fan favourite, was criticised for ducking him because he was talking about moving up to welterweight to fight Nate Diaz, but didn't show interest in fighting Colby Covington at all. Covington was routinely calling out Dustin Poirier's wife in interviews and was able to make Laura Sanko giggle at one point.
And, let them enjoy themselves. Kind of like what Dustin does when Conor's in bed with his wife.
I don't know how to say that. A 5-round fight, but you look great. You don't have a lot of damage.
But a lot of people overlooked the fact that he actually directly called out Dustin Poirier's child, who at the time was around 6 years old.
Dustin, name the site, bring that wife and bring Conor's little kid, Parker.
Guess what, Dustin? You name the site. Let's do it. Bring that little Jezebel of a wife and that little prop you call as a kid.
If you were going to say that about somebody's innocent child who has absolutely nothing to do with the fight, you deserve to get punched in the face. But instead of being criticised by a lot of fans, Colby Covington was routinely defended, and people who pointed out the fact that I just did were often labelled as soft, even though Colby Covington years before had called the cops on Fabricio Verdum for throwing a boomerang at him.
And where's the equality at? All the people in the world that are saying, oh, he's a snitch, he went to the cops. Yeah, you're condoning violence because of free speech. You know who else created, you know what that's called? That's called fascism. You know who else believed in fascism? Adolf Hitler and the Nazis.
Covington had garnered a lot of fan support around him, whether it was his support for Donald Trump, his anti-woke narrative, or that maybe his trash talk had simply grown on fans. He had built a pretty loyal fan base around him without having to take on any top contenders who were coming off wins. After getting sucker punched by Jorge Masvidal, Colby Covington went into hiding. This guy was almost turning up on milk cartons, and a lot of fans suspected as to whether or not he was going to fight again, or if he was going to routinely call out Leon Edwards, who had suddenly dethroned Kamaru Usman in some kind of creative way. Well, the latter is true. He did call out Leon Edwards and was given a title shot out of absolute nowhere when he had done nothing since that incident with Masvidal. Immediately, a lot of fans had turned on him because whether you like Colby Covington or not, and regardless of how you feel about the other contenders, he was by far the least deserving contender in the top 5. Belal Muhammad had earned the title shot. Gilbert Burns had called Colby Covington out. And even though Khamzat Chimaev did not deserve the title shot because of how he handled the weight situation before the Nate Diaz fight, it's fair to say that he deserved a fight against Colby Covington since Covington had been given 2 title shots within 2 years when only beating Tyron Woodley before the second one, who was coming off multiple losses. And when Aljamain Sterling and Henry Cejudo badly needed some support for their event, Colby Covington not only didn't put his hand up, but he laughed at the idea of Gilbert Burns and Belal Muhammad overstepping him, even though they had both called him out and were fighting to earn a title shot. Colby Covington was very lucky that the fight was insanely boring, and that Belal Muhammad had almost no fan support whatsoever after the win. Suddenly, fans didn't care about Covington getting an undeserved title shot, because one thing you can't deny is that Colby Covington did put his all into those fights with Kamaru Usman, and fans expected the exact same against Leon Edwards. So Covington, in terms of his fan support, was okay heading into the Leon Edwards fight, and at the press conference, he did come up with a somewhat unique idea by coming in dressed up as one of the founding fathers, living up to his trash talk that he was going to beat back the British champion like his ancestors beat back the British Empire. Even after Covington made the infamous comment about Leon Edwards' deceased father, a lot of fans didn't turn on him at the time because many believed that if you were going to come out and say something that crass and disrespectful, there is no way whatsoever you could go down without giving it your all and potentially risk getting knocked out. Myself included, I thought Colby Covington was going to go down swinging in this fight, and boy was I wrong. The only way you can describe Colby Covington's performance at UFC 296 is pathetic. He came out looking to take the least amount of risks possible, only slightly going for it in the 5th and final round after getting picked apart routinely by Leon Edwards' leg kicks, and clearly outpointed in the fight, only to do the belt motion afterwards, acting like he believed he won, and he could once again peddle this pre-rehearsed narrative that he was hard done by, and they simply didn't like him because of his affiliation with Donald Trump, who looked just as disappointed after the fight as a lot of fans were. It was very clear at this point that Colby Covington was not interested whatsoever in being a serious fighter. He was all about this image of being this pro-Trump, anti-woke, counterculture figure, and the safest way he could preserve that is by not taking a lot of damage in the fight and being able to spin a ridiculous narrative afterwards that he felt he won.
I thought I had rounds 3, 4, and 5.
Even in the eyes of a lot of his hardcore fans, this was almost as bad as throwing a fight, because he clearly had no intention of winning. And even the most die-hard Colby Covington supporters couldn't deny that he had just wasted everybody's time, and was pulling off an acting performance, and everything that happened afterwards was just further destruction to his image. Colby Covington really started to dig his own grave. When he finally got finished saying that he felt he won the fight, he called out Stephen Wonderboy Thompson and was so desperate to avoid Shavkat Rakhmonov, it is laughable.
You know, there's a guy that's been talking a lot of shit to me in the media, you know, Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. You know, everybody thinks he's a nice guy. He's had a lot to say about me, so I'd love to see him say that to me in the cage, in the octagon. Oh, he was just saying some stuff before the fight. Oh, he's going to get his jaw broke. Oh, this and that. You know, he's always talking shit, throwing shade, so I'd love to see him say it to my face. You know, he's always got things to say to you guys in the media, but I've never seen him come up to me face to face. You know, we were backstage at the press conference. He kept his head down the whole time.
At Shavkat Rakhmonov, if the UFC decided to go down that route, is that something you would welcome, fighting Shavkat Rakhmonov next?
You know, it doesn't really make sense. You know, I think, you know, Wonderboy has a bigger name. It's a bigger fight for the division, bigger business for the UFC.
Stephen Thompson said disrespectful things about him. Not only is that such a ridiculous lie to begin with, but if you listen to Colby Covington's voice, he sounds like he's breaking inside. He sounds like his feelings are hurt. And this is a guy who could not do an interview without saying everybody else was in their feelings. This is only the beginning of unpacking the crazy amount of contradictions of Colby Covington. Less than a month after the fight, he posted so-called evidence that he had broken his foot in the first kick of the fight. And this somehow justified his performance. And whether you're a Covington fan or not, this was one of the most pathetic excuses I had ever seen. I've already talked about how terrible that performance was at 296. For him to try and justify that a month after the fight is just further embarrassment. And if you look at the comments and the dislikes on these interviews he did, not even his hardcore fans could defend him at this point. Covington just made himself look even worse in an interview where he suddenly tried to fight Bilal Muhammad, a guy he had routinely downplayed for several years. And whether you like Bilal Muhammad or not, I already showed screenshots of him calling Covington out last year. And even though Bilal Muhammad has never been a fan favourite, a lot of fans had eased off of him because they understood they couldn't blame the guy for being boring when Colby Covington had just put on one of the most pathetic performances seen in many years. When Muhammad was calling Covington out, he was as quiet as a church mouse. Suddenly, when Covington had received another undeserved title shot and lost, he wanted to fight Muhammad so badly and had the audacity to say things like this.
He doesn't deserve a title fight, guys. How long has he sat out? He sat out for over a year. He's squatting on his ranking. You know, that's not right, guys. He's squatting. You know, he doesn't deserve it. What does he deserve? What has he done lately? When was his last fight?
There's the pot calling the kettle black, folks, and then there's this. I only thought politicians could make so many outrageous statements in a single interview. Then it gets even worse, because Colby Covington is actually going to make me defend Ian Garry. Covington popped back up on Instagram and seemed to have realised that in order for him to get back in the good graces with the fans, he had to fight a guy who was more hated than him. And in this Instagram video, he was sure to speak his usual catchphrases and then called out Garry with some infamous stipulations.
Stipulation number 1, you and that gold digging whore got to turn your Instagram comments back on. And if you turn them off before the fight, you forfeit the fight. Stipulation number 2. Ian, we've heard you cry and beg on your knees, but we all know that you're not the boss and you don't wear the pants in the relationship. Layla, you got 60 seconds to convince me and the people why this fight needs to happen. So put your husband in the corner, get on your hands and knees, and beg. Now for stipulation number 3, my personal favorite. 15 seconds of fame, Layla? I'll give you your 15 seconds of fame right here for America's Pick of the Week. After I beat your husband, because that's a foregone conclusion, I will beat him.
And I'll be honest, I was not one of the people who thought that this was a tactic to duck Ian Garry. I thought this was Colby Covington trying to publicly embarrass Ian Garry since he didn't get a chance to do it at the press conference for 296. I thought he would actually take the fight because he knew this was his chance to get back in the title picture against a very winnable opponent. But I was wrong again. Covington confirmed that those stipulations were actually genuine, and he felt that Ian Garry not meeting them actually meant he didn't want to fight. Then he went into a victim mindset of talking about how difficult it was for him to rise to the top of the division, and how life was so difficult for him because he had to go to Brazil and face the wrath of the local crowd.
Yeah, so, I gave him some simple stipulations, guys. You guys know better than anybody, having followed my career, what I've had to go through to get to this point in my career. I literally went to Brazil, and I had people that wanted to take my head off with a fork and take my head off with some assault rifles outside the arena because those Brazilian fans were so pissed at what I did to them and the things that I had to do to get to this point. So.
Oh, boo-hoo! Let me play a sad song for you on the world's smallest violin.
Could you imagine if every fighter who fought a Brazilian in Brazil came out with this kind of statement? Everybody would be called complainers. And that's what Colby Covington was showing himself to be. If he's not putting on an acting performance outside the octagon and not even fighting, he's going to put on an acting performance inside the octagon. And when he's not doing that, he's just going to call people out when the fights don't make sense, and do it in such a way that he's complaining, like somebody who is all up in their feelings. Suddenly, that video of him justifying calling the cops on Fabrizio Verdun many years ago that I played seems very familiar because Colby's voice is breaking in a similar way to how it is now. And as if Colby couldn't make himself look any worse, there are his comments about Sean Strickland that we need to unpack. On Adam Sosnick's show with a bunch of women where, like I said earlier, he has so much makeup on his face, I wonder if he's looking for a new career path. Of course, I'm joking. When Sean Strickland came out with very critical things to say about UFC fighter pay, Covington went out of his way to defend it when he had been at odds with the company in the past.
Sean changed his life, so he's kind of hypocritical to be saying this. Now he lives in like a really nice like mansion style type house, has great cars and has money in the bank. So who is he to say this? I don't know why he's so mad about the UFC. They made him a millionaire too. So
Covington is coming out and heavily defending the UFC from Strickland. And regardless of how you feel about UFC fighter pay, whether it is fair or not, he just comes across as somebody who is hell-bent on defending his daddy, when Covington used to have similar disputes with the UFC back when he was first challenging for the title.
No, I'm not happy with what I'm being compensated. I'm being underpaid, I'm being undervalued, and the UFC needs to pay up, and if they don't pay up after this fight, you'll probably see me in WWE.
Now, he comes across as a spoiled child, almost like a teacher's pet, when Strickland doesn't get the extra privilege Covington gets. And Covington also sounds like somebody who is just complaining, as I explained earlier in the video. Somebody criticizes his boss, and he needs to come out and white knight for them. And I think a lot of it is because he is jealous of Sean Strickland. Whether you like Sean or not, There's no question he is more popular than Covington has ever been. Like Covington, he offends a lot of people. He calls out agendas. He calls out the media. He's counterculture. And fans love him for it. Whereas Covington has been booed out of arenas several times, Strickland goes to foreign territory and gets cheered in and out of the arenas. He's also seen by many fans, myself included, as a more authentic and entertaining version of Colby Covington. Covington complained about how life was difficult for him because of what he had to go through in Brazil, whereas Strickland went to Canada, called out the Canadian Prime Minister, called out the media directly, who really wanted him to lose, and was cheered out of the arena. And, unlike Covington, he actually won the world title against a decorated champion who was a similar level to Usman, who Covington couldn't dethrone twice. So I think aside from becoming a teacher's pet and white knighting for the UFC, Covington is jealous of somebody who is more authentic and more successful than he has ever been. And once again, he comes across as somebody who is all up in his feelings, which he has always criticized other people for doing. So in conclusion, why is Colby Covington disliked by so many fans now when he's doing things that he has done before when he started this bad guy image? Well, as we have broken down, he wasn't always liked. Later on, he benefited from fighting old men who were on their way out and were disliked by certain segments of the fan base. So, when he put in dominant performances, he was praised heavily by those fans. Also, his trash talk did improve, so fans who appreciated him were able to overlook things such as insulting Dustin Poirier's daughter. When he took a long break and received a title shot he didn't deserve, fans ended up overlooking it because he had a reputation for being entertaining in these title fights, whereas the two guys he overstepped put on a very boring performance. So once again, Covington's reputation was saved. But it all came crashing down when he put in an abysmally boring performance. He was no longer entertaining in these title fights, so there was no defense for him. And instead of showing any humility afterwards, he was just as arrogant and bullish as he was before the fight. And talking about Trump so much to where he had basically sold out his dignity made it impossible for even his hardcore fans to defend him. When you are able to turn your own hardcore fans against you, you know you have messed up. Except Covington didn't realize what he was doing. So now he was so out of touch, fans had no reason to defend him. And talking about showing no humility and no self-awareness, he went to even greater lengths to duck and avoid top challenges against prime contenders, and has gone even further than before in calling out washed up old men. Because, as explained earlier, what matters most to Colby Covington is being able to keep up this image, and by doing that, he has to take the least amount of risks in his career, and has no humility whatsoever to actually be honest with his fans. Because of that, it's hard to spot a Colby Covington fan nowadays because he is one of the most dishonest fighters on the roster. He might as well become a full-time actor because that is exactly what he is doing. Except, unlike most actors, he is not honest about what he is doing. He is so hell-bent on conning his fans and acting like he wants to be remembered as this great fighter who will go in the Hall of Fame. He's one of the most out-of-touch fighters on the entire roster, who has resorted to calling out washed-up old men who may need a walking stick to get to the octagon, acting like some entitled child who wants to be spoiled with the new iPhone every Christmas, but isn't prepared to do anything to earn it. And when things don't go his way, he wants to stay in a safe space among journalists and podcasters who aren't going to criticize him, and from that safe space, he will complain about fighters who have achieved what he keeps talking about doing. The man who claimed to be anti-woke, the man who claimed to be counterculture, the man who claimed to be the people's champ, is nothing more than a fraud who wants to stay in a safe space and be a Karen when talking about fighters who have reached the mountaintop, and he only wants to con his way there rather than actually earn it. For these reasons, Colby Covington most likely will not be remembered for the accomplishments in his career. He won't be remembered as the guy who handed Rafael dos Anjos his first loss at welterweight. He won't be remembered as the guy who beat Damian Maia after he had lost his bid for the title. He won't be remembered for his exciting fights with Kamaru Usman. Most fans will remember him for sitting out waiting for title shots after having wins over washed up old men, looking abysmal against Leon Edwards, and ducking every single top contender he could, and going down as one of the greatest con artists in the last few years in MMA history. So I hope you liked this video about the fall of Colby Covington, how he went from having to save his career to being an unwanted villain to becoming somewhat of a cult hero, to destroying it all within one fight. Let me know your thoughts down below about how Colby Covington's career panned out. How do you think he will be remembered? And do you agree he is one of the greatest frauds and con artists in the last few years in MMA history? Be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more. As always, catch you later.